Viewer guidance is advised. The following content is intended purely for informational and entertainment purposes. Diddy's twin daughters refuse to testify. The collapse begins. The tension inside the federal courtroom could be felt in the air, even before the dramatic moment that would redefine the entire trial. On what was expected to be a routine day, something happened that not even the most seasoned legal analysts could have predicted. The silence that followed a whispered statement from the defense attorney was louder than any gavel strike. In a shocking move, Jesse and Delilah, Diddy's twin daughters, refused to testify in their father's defense. From the beginning of the proceedings, the courtroom had been filled with a buzz of whispered conversations, the scribble of reporters' pens, and the stiff professionalism of lawyers preparing to battle it out. But all of that changed when Marcus Bennett, the lead defense attorney, stepped forward with a strained look. What he said next sent shockwaves through the room. The planned character witnesses, Diddy's own daughters, had withdrawn. The courtroom seemed to freeze in time. The judge paused, eyebrows slightly raised, as gasps rippled across the benches. Even those familiar with high-stakes trials struggled to process what they were witnessing. Diddy, who until that point had managed to keep his composure despite the pressure surrounding the trial, suddenly grabbed at his chest. His breathing grew shallow, eyes darting toward the back of the courtroom where his daughters sat quietly, refusing to meet his gaze. It was a moment of reckoning for the man once known for being in complete control of his career, his image, and his family. The courtroom fell into stunned silence as the judge gave Bennett permission to explain the change. In a composed but hesitant voice, Bennett informed the court that due to unforeseen family circumstances, the twins would no longer be taking the stand. At that moment, the courtroom wasn't just witnessing a legal strategy falling apart, it was watching the emotional collapse of a father. Throughout the trial, Diddy had worked hard to maintain a carefully crafted image. He had always leaned heavily into his role as a family man. His social media accounts were filled with cheerful moments, birthday parties, holidays, vacations. He often spoke about the responsibility he took on after the passing of Kim Porter, the twins' mother, in 2018. That public narrative helped soften the perception of a man otherwise known for his ruthless business persona. The twins were central to that image. They were not just his children. They were the embodiment of his promise to be a better man. Now, those very daughters were sitting in the back row, no longer willing to support that narrative. The courtroom noticed everything: their posture, their silence, the way they avoided looking at their father. It wasn't rebellion. It was the physical expression of an internal moral decision. A quiet refusal to perpetuate a version of truth they could no longer accept. The day before they were set to testify, the twins reportedly had a long and emotional conversation with their godmother, a woman who had been close to their late mother. No one outside that room knows exactly what was said, but the next morning, their legal counsel informed Diddy's defense team that the girls would not be testifying. The decision, while deeply personal, was communicated with calm and finality. In court, Diddy's physical reaction was immediate and severe. His tie felt like a noose, and he began to tug at it as his breathing worsened. The once confident music mogul was now visibly unraveling. The pressure of the moment had cracked through his emotional armor. To the world, Diddy had long appeared as a man who had it all under control. But in that courtroom, everything about that image began to fall apart. The defense had planned to use the twins to showcase a softer, human side of Diddy. Their testimony was meant to paint him as a devoted father, grieving widower, and hands-on parent. He was counting on them to soften the impact of the mounting legal evidence that portrayed him in a far darker light. But as the trial continued, cracks in the family unity began to surface. Sources close to the family mentioned that the twins had become increasingly conflicted. They had attended parts of the trial and heard things that shook the foundation of what they believed about their father. One of the more damning moments came when a former associate took the stand and recounted incidents that starkly contradicted the stories Diddy had told his children. The girls, visibly shaken, left the courtroom that day with tears in their eyes. That evening, they sought comfort and counsel from their godmother. For the first time, they were forced to confront the possibility that their father might not be the man they had always believed he was. It was not an impulsive decision, nor one born of spite. It was a carefully weighed moral stand. In court, their physical choice to sit at the back of the room, rather than behind the defense table, spoke volumes. The symbolic distance was clear. They weren't rebelling. They were stepping back from a truth they no longer recognized. Hands clasped tightly, their expressions were resolute. It was clear they were not acting as emotional teenagers, but as young women making one of the hardest choices of their lives. For Diddy, the moment represented more than just a legal loss. It was the collapse of the image he had curated so carefully. He wasn't just losing witnesses. He was losing the moral support of his own daughters. And for a man so deeply invested in his own narrative, that loss cut deeper than any prosecutor's accusation. Bennett, trying to recover, addressed the court with the modified witness list. But the judge was not about to let it pass so easily. She questioned the reason for the change, and Bennett responded that the girls had exercised their right not to testify. Since they were voluntary character witnesses and not subpoenaed, their decision was legally acceptable, but emotionally devastating. The prosecution immediately seized on the moment, pointing out that the daughters were clearly present in the courtroom and had chosen not to take the stand. The judge acknowledged the obvious. This was not a mere scheduling conflict. It was a public act of refusal. Diddy, trying to maintain his composure, leaned forward to whisper something to his attorney, but then froze. The mask had fallen. His hands trembled. His lips parted, as if to speak, but no words came out. Then, suddenly, he stood. His voice, tight and distressed, echoed across the room as he pleaded for a moment to speak to his daughters. The judge denied the request, instructing him to sit down. But Diddy didn't listen. He tried to explain, to insist that the girls were misunderstanding the situation. It was an uncharacteristic outburst that disrupted the courtroom decorum and exposed just how shaken he truly was. Court officers moved swiftly as the judge issued a warning. Diddy finally slumped back into his chair, defeated, his gaze locked onto his daughters. They remained motionless, focused on the front of the courtroom, never once turning to meet his eyes. A recess was called. Diddy was led into a private side room where a court medical officer was summoned. He was clearly in distress. His breathing was shallow, and his skin was pale. Meanwhile, in a separate room, the twins met privately with their godmother and a family attorney. They looked burdened, faces drawn with the weight of their choice. When the trial resumed, Diddy had regained a small amount of composure, but the change was obvious. His posture was slumped. His gaze was distant. His grip on the defense strategy, both legal and emotional, had slipped. The defense attempted to pivot by calling their next witness, a longtime business associate, but it was already too late. The empty witness chair where the twins should have sat loomed larger than anything said from the stand. The courtroom had witnessed something beyond legal maneuvering. It had seen the unraveling of a public identity. The twins didn't need to say a single word. Their absence had spoken louder than any testimony could. As the second half of the trial day unfolded, the ripple effects of the twins' withdrawal were just beginning to show. What had started as a quiet absence was now snowballing into something much larger, a narrative shift that no amount of legal expertise could contain. Diddy's team scrambled to regain their footing, but the damage had already begun to set in. The new witness, James Reynolds, a longtime business associate, took the stand with the intention of reaffirming Diddy's character. He spoke about Diddy's leadership, philanthropy, and entrepreneurial contributions. But it all felt hollow. The courtroom had already witnessed something far more telling than words. It had seen a father's panic, a family's fracture, and a silence that shouted louder than any testimony. As Reynolds tried to steer the conversation toward Diddy's charitable initiatives and mentorship programs, The prosecution seized the opportunity to reshape the image being projected. Sarah Mitchell, the lead prosecutor, asked probing questions. How did Diddy react when challenged? Was he calm under pressure, or did he respond with force? Reynolds hesitated, visibly uncomfortable. He tried to maintain loyalty, describing Diddy as a man of high standards. But the underlying message became clear. Diddy expected control, obedience, and loyalty, and those who defied him often paid a price. This wasn't just about business. This was about character, and the kind of environment Diddy cultivated around himself. The cross-examination slowly peeled away layers of the public persona Diddy had spent years building. Accounts of strict non-disclosure agreements, confiscated phones during meetings, and a tightly orchestrated brand strategy painted a portrait of someone obsessed with maintaining his version of reality. Nothing went unplanned. Every image, every post, every family moment online was part of a carefully maintained illusion. And now, that illusion was unraveling. What made the twins' silence so devastating was that it wasn't the result of pressure or cross-examination. It wasn't a strategy by the prosecution. It was organic, personal, and real. That authenticity gave their silence more weight than any calculated move by the state. The jury wasn't just listening to legal arguments anymore. They were watching a man lose control over the very people he claimed to cherish most. During a break in proceedings, observers caught a glimpse of Diddy and Bennett in what looked like a heated discussion. Though the words weren't audible, their body language was unmistakable. Diddy pointed repeatedly toward the back of the courtroom, clearly referencing his daughters. Bennett responded with steady, measured gestures, clearly attempting to calm his client and prevent further escalation. But when the court resumed, it was obvious to everyone that the divide wasn't closing. The twins returned to the same seats in the back row, their faces unreadable. There was no eye contact with their father. No nod of recognition. Just silence and distance. As another witness took the stand to discuss Diddy's influence in promoting black-owned businesses and supporting underserved communities, the contrast became starker. Here was a man being celebrated for building others up, while simultaneously watching the closest people in his life break away from him. This wasn't a story about business anymore. It was about family. About legacy. About a father who had built an empire but could no longer reach his own daughters. Diddy's usual charisma, the commanding presence that had dominated boardrooms and award shows, was gone. In its place was a man quietly watching the distance between himself and his daughters grow wider with each passing hour. As the day neared its end, the defense called its final witness. Another longtime partner spoke of Diddy's vision, his drive, and his cultural impact. The words were strong, but the impact was weak. Without the emotional reinforcement the twins were supposed to provide, the testimony lacked soul. And then came the final break before closing arguments. It was during this moment, in the quiet hallway just outside the courtroom, that the most emotional exchange of the trial took place. The twins, accompanied by their godmother and their attorney, prepared to leave for the day. Diddy, who had remained seated after the last witness, suddenly rose and followed them into the hallway. Security officers took position immediately, sensing tension. Diddy called out, not with anger, but desperation. His voice cracked. He didn't want confrontation. He wanted connection. He asked for just 5 minutes, one last chance to speak to his daughters. Their godmother stepped in. Her stance was firm but calm. She reminded him that this wasn't the right place or time. But Diddy pushed, insisting they didn't understand what was really at stake. That everything he had done was for them. That the future he had built was meant to be their inheritance. It was Delilah who broke the silence first. Her words were quiet, but strong. She explained that they understood more than he realized. That it was because of what they now knew, not in spite of it, that they made their decision. Jesse followed, echoing the sentiment. They still loved him, but they could no longer say what he wanted them to say, not after everything they had heard. The moment was raw, exposed, and heartbreaking. And then came the sentence that would reverberate through the rest of the trial. Diddy, eyes filled with anguish, told them their mother would never have allowed this. But before either daughter could respond, their godmother did. Her tone shifted. It was sharp, cutting through the emotion with controlled fury. She reminded Diddy that Kim would have protected her daughters at all costs, even if that meant protecting them from him. The confrontation ended there. The twins turned and left, heads high but eyes wet. Reporters nearby captured the entire scene in scribbled notes and whispered commentary. And as Diddy returned to the courtroom alone, it was clear to everyone that something irreversible had occurred. When the court reconvened, Diddy was a shadow of the man who had entered that building weeks earlier. He sat motionless, barely responding to his attorney. The room was quiet as Bennett began his closing argument. He delivered a methodical summary of Diddy's achievements, his contributions to music, to community programs, to entrepreneurship. But none of it carried the emotional weight it needed. There was no longer a family narrative to hold up as a shield. Throughout the closing, Diddy gave no signals, no reactions. He didn't nod, didn't smile, didn't even acknowledge his defense team. His energy was gone. His focus, once legendary, had evaporated. All he could do was sit and listen as the carefully constructed version of himself crumbled. At the conclusion of the argument, the judge announced that the prosecution would deliver their closing the following morning. The twins immediately rose and left the courtroom. They didn't glance at their father, and he didn't call out to them. But those watching knew he wanted to. As he sat there, still and silent, his head slowly dropped into his hands. It was a gesture not of legal defeat, but of emotional devastation. That simple movement, captured by sketch artists and echoed across headlines the next day, would come to define this moment in the trial. It wasn't a celebrity breakdown. It was a father realizing he had lost the one thing he truly couldn't afford to lose: his children's trust. This wasn't about verdicts anymore. This was about family. And in the eyes of the public, the trial had already delivered its most powerful testimony, one that didn't come from the stand, but from a choice made by two young women who chose integrity over allegiance. The following morning, the courtroom was filled to capacity. The news of the twins' refusal to testify and Diddy's emotional collapse had spread far beyond the courthouse walls. Spectators, legal analysts, and reporters packed the room, sensing that the end of this trial would bring more than just a verdict. It would bring a reckoning. As Diddy entered, he looked markedly diminished. The man who once moved through life with magnetic energy now walked slowly, his designer suit hanging loosely on his frame. His usual entourage was absent. Only his legal team remained by his side. Even his confident expression had faded. What replaced it was a hollow gaze and a man weighed down by something far heavier than legal pressure. The twins entered shortly after, accompanied not only by their godmother but now by their maternal grandmother, Kim Porter's mother, who had flown in overnight. The gesture wasn't lost on anyone. It was a clear sign of generational support for the decision the girls had made. They took seats even farther back than before, maintaining the emotional distance they had already made physical. When the prosecutor, Sarah Mitchell, stood to deliver her closing argument, the courtroom fell silent. She spoke calmly but firmly, outlining the pattern of behavior that had emerged through the trial. This, she reminded the jury, was not just about business practices or financial manipulation. It was about control. It was about how one man had built an empire not only on talent and determination but also on the expectation of total obedience. Mitchell carefully steered the jury's attention not just to the evidence, but to what they had witnessed. She reminded them that character was not only described through words but revealed through actions. When the people closest to the defendant, the very daughters he had once held up as symbols of his fatherhood, chose not to speak on his behalf, that silence had to be weighed. Defense counsel immediately objected, calling it speculative. The judge sustained the objection but allowed Mitchell to proceed with caution. Mitchell adjusted her language, but the impact of her message remained. She didn't need to speculate. Everyone in the room had seen the moment Diddy broke. They had seen how the carefully constructed image of a devoted father dissolved in real time, under the silent weight of his daughter's decision. As Mitchell continued her argument, Diddy's physical discomfort returned. His breathing grew shallow, and his skin turned visibly pale. Then, suddenly, he stood up, swaying slightly. His attorney requested a recess, but before the judge could respond, Diddy began to speak. His voice cracked as he looked toward the back of the courtroom, eyes fixed on the twins. He said he had done everything for them. That all he had built, he built for their future. Court officers rushed to steady him, but he didn't resist. He collapsed back into his seat, clutching his chest, overcome with emotion. The judge immediately called for a recess and ordered medical assistance. Diddy was escorted from the room to receive care for what was later confirmed to be a severe anxiety attack. The courtroom emptied, buzzing with whispers. The moment had been raw, unscripted, and unforgettable. Outside, media outlets exploded with the story. Analysts debated the trial's direction, but few believed the defense could recover. The silence of the twins had become more powerful than any spoken testimony. One commentator described it as the most devastating character statement possible, delivered without a single word. Social media platforms lit up with reactions. Some praised the girls for their courage. Others speculated about outside influence. But through it all, Jesse and Delilah remained composed, their faces hidden behind tinted car windows as they were escorted away. Inside their vehicle, witnesses later said, they wept silently. When court resumed the next day, Diddy returned looking physically steadier but emotionally closed off. His gaze stayed low. His posture remained still. The twins did not appear in person. Their attorney informed the court they would observe remotely from a secure location. Mitchell concluded her closing argument without further incident. Her words tied the emotional impact of the family rupture to the legal charges. She didn't push further on the twins, knowing their silence already spoke louder than anything else she could offer. The jury retired for deliberation shortly after. It didn't take long. After just 7 hours, they returned with a unanimous verdict: guilty on all major counts. Diddy stood motionless as the decision was read aloud. He didn't react. He didn't blink. His team quickly announced plans to appeal, but the gravity of the moment was undeniable. As he was led away, the most lasting image wasn't of courtroom celebration or defeat. It was a sketch that soon circulated across newspapers and television. A drawing of 2 teenage girls sitting quietly at the back of the courtroom, refusing to speak for their father. In the days that followed, sources close to the family revealed a deeper layer to the story. Jesse and Delilah had reportedly received a letter from their late mother, Kim Porter, written years earlier and intended to be opened on their 16th birthday. Though the contents of that letter were never made public, those who knew the family said its words took on new weight during the trial. It offered them guidance, clarity, and a moral compass that ultimately shaped their decision. This wasn't a reaction to a single moment. It was the culmination of years of silent questions, gradually answered by truth. The impact rippled outward. Across the entertainment world, the twins' refusal became a cultural statement. It signaled a new era, one where power no longer guaranteed blind loyalty. Where daughters, even in the spotlight, could draw the line between truth and family expectation. Jesse and Delilah became unexpected role models, not because they were perfect, but because they were principled. In a brief statement released through their attorney, they explained that their decision had been deeply personal. That they still loved their father. That they needed privacy to heal. What stood out most was what the statement didn't say. There was no backtracking, no regret, no reversal. And perhaps that was the final message. That the truth, once seen, cannot be unseen. And sometimes, the hardest thing to do for someone you love is to stop protecting their illusions. 3 weeks after the verdict, the twins were photographed visiting a women's shelter with their grandmother and godmother. They made a generous donation in their mother's name. It was a quiet act, but a powerful one. A reminder that even in the aftermath of heartbreak, healing begins with action. And that silence, when chosen with integrity, can become the most powerful voice of all.